Wang, Bamboo Refuge. Sitting alone in dense bamboo, I play my lute and sing along. In these deep woods unknown to people, the moon arrives. We shine together. So we continue with Wang Wei's quatrains, of which we have 5 in this collection. This is the second one of his pentasyllabic quatrains, and this one, along with the one we talked about extensively in the previous 2 recordings, is part of the Wang River collection that he wrote with Pei Di. So the place that it is talking about, the bamboo refuge, is, probably a very specific, a very real, physical locus. And the scene that he is describing is, probably quite close to a real scene that he experienced while spending time in his state. So, very briefly, what's the topic of this poem? Well, I would say the topic of this poem, evidently there's a landscape element, which is very important. But I would say the main idea in this poem, more than describing any specific bamboo refuge, is the topic of landscape, nature, the connection, the communion of the poet with nature, loneliness. But here loneliness, I construe it as having a positive meaning, as opposed to what is typical in most Chinese poetry, and attainment of illumination and harmony with nature, I would say, is also a big topic of this poem. So it connects with the religious and natural poetry of Wang Wei, although in at least one aspect it does break the conventional view of Wang Wei's poetry, as we will comment in a minute. So let's go as usual couplet by couplet. In fact, in these quatrains it almost pays more to go line by line, because there's so many lines and so many couplets to comment upon. Okay, so first thing, the first couplet. Sitting alone in dense bamboo, I play my lute and sing along. A lot of interesting things to say about this couplet. So first of all, from the title and from this couplet, we get a lot of classical imagery. So this looks like a pretty simple couplet, but there are many implicit and explicit references to cultural traditions that make the poem meaningful. So bamboos, especially bamboo groves, are very representative of a group of intellectuals and of Taoistic thought. So during the period of disunion, in the early period of disunion, in the middle years of the 3rd century of our era, there was a group of writers, poets, intellectuals, Taoist intellectuals, called the 7 Sages of the Bamboo Grove, who basically retired from the world. They rejected the corruption of contemporary politics and power grabbing and the hypocrisy and Pharisaic self-righteousness of Confucianism. And they dedicated themselves to enjoying each other's company and to practicing Taoist religious and meditational and cultural and artistic practices. So they lived out of civilization, and there they engaged in different attitudes. So this reference to bamboo refuge, and in the second couplet to singing along and playing the lute, even if it's meant to be appreciated directly or to be read literally as just the poet is in a dense forest and he's just playing for himself and whistling for himself, this is imbued, consciously or unconsciously, with these Taoistic overtones. So the poem, I would say, has a Buddhist message, but Buddhism and Taoism, especially Chan Buddhism and Taoism, overlap sometimes in this view of nature and of meditation alone, away from civilization. And nature is the key to achieving, in one case, in the case of Buddhism, illumination. In the case of Taoism, well, prolonged lifespans or true knowledge of the Tao, of the way the cosmos and the universe works. So the bamboo is interesting. It's there is probably a big clump of bamboo where Wang Wei's poetic persona is, but bamboo can also be used as a symbol. It's empty on the inside, but it grows very vigorously. So remember, emptiness is a key concept in in Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, shunyata. And another interesting thing, this is from the second line. So the poet is doing the things that a scholar official does in his free time. So he's playing the lute, singing along. Scholar officials usually like doing these things with company, because remember, they are a very social group. Social reading poetry and enjoying cultural pleasures is a social activity in classical China. Here it's done alone. But the singing, for example, the poet here, which is Michael Farman, has chosen to translate the end of the second couplet as singing along. This is slightly misleading, I believe, from other translations and from the original. The word that is used is actually more like whistling. And this connects us again with Taoism. I think we've encountered it already in at least one poem in this collection. There was a certain, one of the Taoist meditative practices, along with certain dietary habits and certain religious practices and mantra-like recitations and so on. One of the Taoist religious practices was whistling. It was a type of mystical religious sort of whistling. In fact, you have some treatises from some of the sages of the bamboo grove about this. And this was supposed to be a practice that, connected with the essential energy, with the essential air, the qi, and that allowed to regulate its flow and, to strengthen it in yourself and therefore to allow you to live more. So this singing along and playing the lute connects, of course, with pleasures of a scholar official, but it also connects with religious practices of a Taoist. Even though, as we say, Wang is not strictly speaking a Taoist, it's more of a Buddhist. Another interesting element, before we move to the second couplet, is that the typical image of the stereotype of Wang Wei in his poetry is that in his poetry we generally get disembodied views of nature, like based in part on traditional classical poetry's avoidance of pronouns. Wang Wei's nature scenes generally picture a nature that seems devoid of human presence, and we saw this very clearly in the Deer Park Hermitage poem. But here, on the contrary, Wang Wei is physically present. It is clear that he is sitting alone, well, he, or the poetic persona of Wang Wei, is sitting in the bamboo and is playing his musical instruments, and he is embedded physically in nature. So this poem will probably play a different theme, as we mentioned. It's no longer a disembodied nature, as might have appeared in the previous poem. It's a nature in which man and his surroundings, in some sort of a communion or connection, or perhaps in an agonistic sort of relationship, achieve something meaningful. Second couplet. In these deep woods, unknown to people, the moon arrives. We shine together. So the poet is alone, playing his musical instrument, doing his breathing Taoistic practices. He is deep in the woods, and he is alone. Not only is he alone, but it's unknown to people that he's there. Well, the unknown in the original Chinese is a bit ambiguous. We will unpack in a minute what this unknown to people may refer to. But anyway, while he's doing that, the moon appears in the sky, as if to accompany, as if to reward Wang Wei with its company or with its visual image. And we shine together. The moon is shining, but Wang Wei, achieving his own sort of illumination or pleasure or happiness or whatever, is also shining like the moon. So, a few interesting things of this part of the couplet. First of all, I get reminded of, do you remember Li Bai's poem that we read, Drinking Alone Under the Moon? There is an element of that poem here, I would say. We also have this paradoxical representation of the scholar official in his loneliness, not in his social capacity, but he is not really lonely. In a way here, he's playing his music and singing his song for the moon. So the moon becomes personified as a witness, as a figure, as a fellow scholar official, if you will, that is collaborating and witnessing Wang Wei's performance. So it says, in the deep woods, unknown to people. So in this translation, what is unknown to people seems to be that the moon arrives. But I think there is an ambiguity even in the translation, which is clearly present in the Chinese. So the original Chinese says, people not know. And the object of this is not at all clear. So there are many possible interpretations, and some would say, especially the followers of new criticism, that ambiguity and multiple interpretations are part of the source of the spice in any poem. So what might be unknown? Different things might be unknown. First of all, the existence of the woods themselves. Perhaps people don't know that these woods exist, these retired, deep woods, far away from civilization. Another interpretation is that that what people might not know is the meaning of these woods, and this connects us with Buddhism, and but also traditional Taoist thought about nature and the opposition of civilization and culture versus nature, and the illuminating aspect of nature, how one can discover the truth, the Tao, only when one is away from social preconceptions and deceptions. Perhaps the unknown to people is the fact that Wang Wei is deep in the woods, and perhaps what is unknown is what Wang Wei is doing in the woods, or what being in the woods represents for Wang Wei, the way in which the woods, knowledge, true knowledge of the woods, allows Wang Wei to achieve some sort of spiritual, intellectual, metaphysical, religious illumination. Or perhaps that illumination is the thing that is unknown to people. You could say that the moon appearing at the end, the moon is also a very traditional Buddhist symbol of illumination, could represent this achievement of this sort of transcendence, of religious transcendence by Wang Wei, of this connection of achieving illumination with being alone and in nature, which, as we mentioned, this is up to a point a Taoistic conceit, but it's more typically Chan Buddhist, although Chan Buddhism was heavily influenced by Taoism. It's the only great Buddhist Mahayana sect, in fact, to be born outside of India. It was born in China. Now, for Chan Buddhists, there's this paradoxical belief in how can I say it? The belief that nirvana is a goal that is to be attained, but nirvana is also present in this very own world, in this very own moment. Nirvana is in samsara. Chan Buddhism relishes paradoxes, and this is part and parcel of their mistrust of language and of their mistrust of rational thought and even of theological, scriptural thought of scriptures. So Taoism believes that, reaching the real is like a roundabout trip in which we start with the false perceptions of the real world. We get the intellectual, the theoretical refutations of those perceptions of the real world, but then we achieve real illumination, and that gets us back to a situation that, in a way, is similar to our starting position. I think there was a Buddhist priest or teacher who said something like, "Before I studied Chan, I believed mountains were mountains. When I studied Chan, I discovered that mountains were no longer mountains. And when I reached illumination, I discovered that mountains were indeed mountains." So, and the typical texts of the Chan school are the koans, those linguistic paradoxes that are meant to unhinge the traditional conceptions and prejudices of the mind. Also, for Chan Buddhists, it's very important to a very important belief is instant illumination is achievable, and it's generally achievable in communion with nature or doing the most quotidian or the most commonplace of activities, like cleaning a toilet. So I would connect all of this with this idea. In the woods, meditating. Meditating itself is, in theory, the main practice of all the Chan sects. In fact, the name Chan is the Chinese version of the Sanskrit word dhyana, which means meditation, and was the main practice of the Chan school. So while in the woods, meditating deeply, illumination has arrived. The moon comes, and the poet shines like the moon because the poet has attained some level of illumination inspiration. So I think that's all for this short but densely packed poem. And just to conclude on a side note, the image that comes to mind when I'm thinking of this poem is not a Chinese but a Japanese painting. There is a painting, medieval scroll, with, I think it's the Buddhist priest Myoe, And it's a lovely painting. I recommend you search for it in the internet. Myoe, M-Y-O-E. And in this scroll, in this painting, he is in the middle of the forest, in the middle of a branched and forested landscape, serene, calm, and like in a womb, you could say. And I think it represents very well the spirit of this poem, this communion of man with nature, of this hermetic image of the person away from civilization, but also integrated into nature, forming a one with his surroundings.